Hey guys, tonight we're doing something your HR department would never approve. We're exploring the concept of retirement. More specifically, we're going to find out why it didn't exist for most of human history, what happened to old people before it was invented, and what genius, or more accurately, what desperate political calculation, finally convinced someone to pay people to just stop working. Because here's the thing, nobody tells you in your 20s. For the vast majority of human history, you worked until you died. There was no gold watch, no farewell party with sheet cake and a card signed by people who misspelled your name, no carefully curated portfolio, no social security check, no slow Tuesday morning in Florida with a crossword puzzle and a cat named Gerald. You got up, you worked, you stopped working when your body stopped cooperating, and then, shortly after that, you stopped existing. So before you get comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. And a huge, heartfelt thank you to the viewer who suggested tonight's topic. Honestly, the best ideas come straight from you, and this one is a gem. It is exactly the kind of history that sounds boring from a distance, and then slowly reveals itself to be deeply, uncomfortably personal. Leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see who's up at this hour, staring at the ceiling, thinking about their 401,000. Also, a quick note, the channel is now on Spotify, so if you'd like to fall asleep to this in a slightly different app, the link is in the description. Now, dim those lights, turn on a fan if you've got one, arrange your pillows into whatever configuration currently passes for comfort in your life, and settle in. Because I want you to think about a few things first. Have you ever actually considered what retirement is when you strip away all the brochures? It's the radical idea that after a certain number of years of labour, a society will agree to keep you alive without requiring you to do anything useful in exchange. That's it. That's the whole concept. And for most of human history, no civilization on Earth thought that was a reasonable arrangement. You were useful, or you found a way to make yourself useful, or things got very uncomfortable very quickly. So what did old people actually do before pensions existed? Did ancient Romans have a plan? Did medieval grandmothers get to relax, or were they still churning butter at 82? When did someone finally look at an aging population and think, you know what? Maybe we should pay these people to go home. And more importantly, why? Was it kindness? Was it economics? Was it, and spoiler it was, a German chancellor trying to undercut socialists in the 1880s? And what does any of this mean for the fact that you are currently lying in a bed that your great-great-grandmother would have considered extraordinary luxury, passively absorbing history through a speaker, hoping to drift off before the anxiety sets back in? Congratulations, you have just woken up in a world without retirement. The year doesn't matter. Pick any year before 1889 and the rule's the same. You work. Everyone works. You work until the work kills you, or until someone younger and faster comes along and takes your job, and then you work at whatever is left. There is no plan B. There is only the plan, and the plan is labour, all the way down. Welcome. Let's begin. The word retirement implies there was something to retire from, a defined working life with a recognisable beginning, middle and end. But for most of human history, that structure simply didn't exist. Work wasn't a phase of life, it was life itself, woven into every waking hour from the moment you were old enough to be useful to the moment your body refused to cooperate. Before we can understand what happened to old people, we need to understand how old was defined, and the answer is less about age and more about capacity. In ancient agricultural societies, you were old when you could no longer do what your community needed you to do. Not when you turned a specific number. Not when you hit a milestone birthday. When you slowed down. When your hands shook too much. When the harvest took you 3 days instead of 1. That was old age. Not a number on a document, but a quiet, creeping demotion from the world of the useful. There were no birthday cakes marking the transition. No HR department pulling you aside to discuss your timeline. You just noticed, one season at a time, that the gap between what you used to do and what you could actually do was getting wider. Your neighbour's son was outpacing you in the field. The basket you used to carry one-handed now needed 2. The walk to the mill that once took 20 minutes was somehow taking 45, and you weren't entirely sure when that had happened. The cruel irony of aging in the ancient world is that it often arrived faster than we'd expect today, and for entirely preventable reasons. Decades of hard physical labour without adequate nutrition, without medical care, without anything resembling ergonomic awareness, because obviously nobody was thinking about lumbar support in 4000 BCE, meant that bodies wore out early and wore out hard. A 45-year-old farmer in ancient Mesopotamia might have the joints of what we'd now consider a 70-year-old. Not because 45 was genuinely old, but because 45 years of that particular life had cost that much. Different societies drew the line differently, and those differences reveal a lot about what a civilization actually valued. In cultures that prized physical strength, hunting societies, warrior cultures, early agricultural communities where the margin between enough food and not enough was razor thin, the transition from contributor to dependent could happen abruptly and without ceremony. In cultures that accumulated and transmitted knowledge, where what you knew mattered as much as what you could lift, age carried a different kind of currency. An elder who remembered where the water source was during the last drought, who knew which plants were safe to eat in which season, who had navigated the last 3 territorial disputes with the neighbouring group. That person had value that didn't diminish the way muscle did. In many indigenous societies around the world, this is still understood intuitively in ways that modern Western culture has largely forgotten. What's striking when you look across the full sweep of human history is that old age has never had a single fixed meaning. It's always been negotiated between the aging person and their community, between what a body can do and what a society needs done, between what someone has accumulated in knowledge and what they can no longer contribute in labour. The number on the calendar was almost beside the point. The question was always simpler and more brutal than that. Are you still useful? And the answer determined everything about what happened next. Modern retirement, in a sense, was invented so that the answer to that question didn't have to be the end of the story. Before governments, before pensions, before savings accounts, there was a brutally simple economic reality. If you didn't produce, you didn't eat. This wasn't cruelty, or at least it wasn't designed as cruelty. It was just physics. In subsistence economies, where most of the ancient world lived for most of recorded history, there was rarely enough surplus food to support people who contributed nothing to its production. If you were too old to farm, too frail to hunt, too stiff to carry water or tend animals, your continued existence placed a genuine burden on everyone around you, and communities weren't always in a position to absorb that burden gracefully. This is the uncomfortable baseline against which everything that follows needs to be measured. The invention of retirement was not inevitable. It required surplus, organisation, and a political will that took centuries to develop. Before all of that, the default was simple and unsparing. You worked, or you made yourself useful in some other way, or you found yourself in a very precarious position. Think about what subsistence living actually means, because the word subsistence is so bland it barely communicates the reality. It means you are producing exactly enough to survive, maybe a little more in a good year, definitely less in a bad one. There is no cushion, no reserve, no slack in the system. Every calorie consumed needs to be replaced by equivalent labour somewhere in the chain. When you add a member of the household who is consuming but not producing, you're not just creating an inconvenience, you're potentially tipping a very precarious balance in the wrong direction. This doesn't mean ancient communities were cold-hearted about their elderly members. The evidence, where we can find it, suggests something considerably more complicated than simple abandonment. Skeletal remains from prehistoric sites occasionally show individuals who survived serious injuries or diseases that would have required extended care from others. Care they couldn't have provided for themselves. People were looking after the helpless. But there were limits, and those limits were set not by affection but by calories. What the archaeological and anthropological record shows, across an enormous range of ancient and traditional societies, is that elderly people almost universally found ways to remain useful rather than simply stopping. The work changed, it got lighter, slower, more supervisory, but it didn't stop. Grandmother shelled seeds, minded children, processed food, transmitted knowledge, performed rituals, made tools. Grandfathers supervised, advised, arbitrated disputes, taught skills, remembered things. Usefulness took different forms as the body aged, but the imperative to remain useful never disappeared. Because the moment you stopped being useful in any sense, you were depending entirely on the goodwill of people who were already working very hard and couldn't really afford it. The brutal clarity of this arrangement is almost refreshing compared to the anxious vagueness of modern retirement planning, the spreadsheets, the projections, the arguments about when the market will recover. In the ancient world, the math was immediate and personal. You either contributed enough to justify your place at the fire, or you negotiated a different kind of contribution, or things became very difficult very quickly. There was no algorithm. There was your family, your community, and whatever you could still manage to offer. That was the entire safety net. It was, depending on who your family was and how good the harvest had been, either enough or not. For most of human history, that uncertainty was simply the permanent condition of growing old. In the absence of any formal system, the oldest retirement plan in human history was also the most personal: your children. Across virtually every ancient civilization, the understood contract of family life went something like this. You raise them, you feed them, you teach them everything they need to know, and when you are old and your knees are finished and the fields seem very far away, they take care of you in return. It was an informal insurance policy written in blood and obligation, and it worked reasonably well as long as your children survived, stayed nearby, didn't resent you, and weren't also struggling to feed their own children. None of those conditions were guaranteed. In ancient Mesopotamia, texts survive showing elderly parents writing letters to their adult children, complaining about neglect, essentially the world's first passive-aggressive retirement grievances pressed into clay. In ancient China, filial piety, the sacred duty of children to honour and care for aging parents, was enshrined in law. In Rome, the paterfamilias structure technically gave aging men enormous legal authority over their households, even in old age, though in practice, a frail old man's authority depended heavily on whether his sons felt like listening. The children as pension model had one significant design flaw, which is that it required children, not just children in the abstract, but enough children who survived to adulthood to make the math work. When infant mortality rates are high enough that half your children might die before reaching the age of 5, which was the reality for most of human history in most parts of the world, you needed to have a lot of children to end up with enough adult ones. This is one of the many reasons large families were not just culturally preferred, but economically rational in pre-industrial societies. More children meant more agricultural labour now, and more support later. Every baby was, among other things, a small investment in your own old age. The emotional complexity of this arrangement is something modern people can recognise even if the specific context is foreign. The obligation ran in both directions, and it carried enormous weight. Children who failed to support their aging parents weren't just seen as ungrateful, they were often seen as morally deformed, as having violated something fundamental about what it meant to be a person in a community. In ancient Athens, there was actually a legal process called graphigonion kakoseos, a public prosecution for failing to care for one's parents. You could be dragged into court and stripped of your citizenship rights for neglecting your elderly mother or father. The state had decided that this particular obligation was so important that it warranted criminal enforcement, which tells you something about how often it was apparently being ignored. And yet, the Mesopotamian clay tablets full of parental complaints exist precisely because the system broke down regularly. Children moved away, became poor themselves, died young, quarrelled with their parents over property or inheritance, or simply prioritised their own households over the one they'd come from. The ancient family pension was only as reliable as the people administering it, and people are complicated. What those complaining clay tablets capture, with a vividness that travels across 4,000 years without losing anything in translation, is the specific, familiar anxiety of an aging person, wondering whether the investment they made in the next generation is going to pay off when they need it most. The technology has changed. The anxiety has not. Egypt is often remembered for its monuments, its pharaohs, its elaborate preparations for the afterlife. Less remembered is the fact that most Egyptians spent their entire lives working and expected to do so right up until the end. The afterlife was certainly something to look forward to, assuming your heart weighed less than a feather, which set the bar fairly high, but getting there required a full life of labour first. Farmers worked the flood-fed fields along the Nile from childhood until their bodies gave out. Craftsmen, scribes and artisans worked their trades for decades. Even priests and bureaucrats had active functional roles that they were expected to maintain. What Egypt did have, in a limited sense, was a system of provision for certain categories of skilled workers, the craftsmen at Deir el-Medina, for instance, who built the royal tombs, received grain rations, housing, and a degree of state support that placed them well above the average peasant. But this was not retirement. It was employment with benefits, and it ended when the employment ended. Deir el-Medina is worth lingering on, because it's one of the most remarkable archaeological sites in Egypt, and one of the most illuminating windows into the actual texture of working life in the ancient world. This was a company town in the desert, purpose-built to house the artisans and labourers who worked on the royal necropolis in the Valley of the Kings. The workers received rations of grain, fish, oil and cloth, their wages paid in commodities rather than currency. They had fixed working schedules, something resembling days off, and access to a rudimentary dispute resolution system when things went wrong. By ancient standards, this was a remarkably comfortable arrangement, but the system also generated an extraordinary archive of paperwork, worker records, complaint documents, payroll accounts, and what those records show is that the state's obligations ran only as long as the work did. An injured worker who could no longer contribute was a problem the system was not really designed to solve. The records include documents about workers who showed up late, workers who were absent due to illness, workers who complained that their rations hadn't arrived. What they don't include is anything resembling a provision for workers who are simply too old to continue. That wasn't a category the ancient Egyptian bureaucracy had invented a box for. For the average Egyptian farmer, the situation was even more straightforwardly dependent on family and community. The Nile flood cycle organised life into a rhythm of labour-intensive farming seasons punctuated by periods of flood, and the great public works projects, the pyramid construction, the canal digging, the monument building, absorbed the labour of farmers who would otherwise have had little to do during the flood months. This wasn't slave labour in the Hollywood sense. It was a system of corvée, of obligatory service to the state, which provided food and lodging in exchange for physical work. Old men who could no longer work the fields and could no longer perform corvée labour were outside this system entirely. They relied on their families, on the informal generosity of their communities, and on whatever accumulated goodwill they had managed to build over a lifetime. It was, in its essentials, the same arrangement as everywhere else in the ancient world. Work until you can't, then hope the people around you are kind enough and well-fed enough to keep you alive. The pyramids lasted 5,000 years. The safety net lasted exactly as long as the family goodwill did. If you had to point to one moment where something resembling modern retirement first flickered into existence, the Roman legionary pension is a reasonable candidate. Roman soldiers served for 20 to 25 years, long, brutal campaigns that left most survivors physically wrecked, geographically displaced, and economically adrift. For much of the Republic, discharged veterans received land grants in newly conquered territories, which was Rome's elegant solution to two problems at once: rewarding soldiers and populating remote provinces with loyal citizens. Under Augustus, the system was formalised further. Veterans received a lump sum cash payment upon discharge, a premia, or bonus. equivalent to roughly 13 years of their annual salary. Not a pension in the ongoing sense, but a settlement, a one-time thank you that was meant to set them up for the rest of their lives. Whether it actually did depended entirely on the veterans' financial discipline, which, given that these were men who had spent 20 years being paid to fight and had very few opportunities to develop savings habits, was not always reliable. The Roman legionary experience is worth understanding in some detail because it represents something genuinely new in human history. The first time a large organised state explicitly acknowledged that people who had served it over a long career were owed something specific and calculable in return. The relationship between Rome and its soldiers was not merely contractual in the modern sense. It was intensely personal, political, and occasionally explosive. Soldiers swore a sacred oath to their commander. Their loyalty was both institutional and intensely individual. And when Rome failed to honour its obligations to veterans, the consequences were severe: mutinies, political crises, the military coups that destabilised the late Republic. Augustus understood this dynamic with exceptional clarity, which is why he established the Aerarium Militare, the dedicated military treasury, specifically to fund veteran payments. This was not money drawn from general revenues at the whim of the Senate. It was a dedicated fund, endowed with personal contributions from Augustus himself, and funded by a 5% inheritance tax that became one of the most unpopular fiscal measures of his reign. The political genius of it was that it separated veteran welfare from the year-to-year political fights over the budget. The soldiers' payments were guaranteed by a dedicated source, which made the promise credible in a way that informal assurances had never been. But the system had limits that foreshadowed every pension debate ever since. The premium was a lump sum, not an ongoing payment, which meant that veterans who lived long and spent freely could outlast their settlement. Land grants were often in remote provinces far from the veterans' actual homes. The system covered only legionary soldiers, the backbone of the Roman army, and not the auxiliary troops who made up a significant proportion of Roman military strength and served just as long under equally brutal conditions, and it covered only the military. For everyone else in Roman society, the merchants, the farmers, the artisans, the urban poor, there was no equivalent provision. You worked, you relied on family, you hoped, or you didn't. The Roman veteran pension was a breakthrough, but it was a breakthrough with a very narrow beam of light. Ancient Athens had strong opinions about old age, and those opinions were deeply contradictory. On one hand, the Greeks celebrated the wisdom that came with age. The elderly held honoured positions in civic life, served on councils, and were expected to be listened to on matters of public importance. On the other hand, Greek comedy was absolutely merciless about old men, decrepit, confused, sexually ridiculous figures stumbling through plots and getting outwitted by clever young people and their servants. Sparta took the most extreme position. Men served the state their entire lives, and the Drusya, the Council of Elders, was literally composed of men over 60 who held significant political power. But this wasn't retirement, it was a different kind of service. The idea that an old Spartan would simply stop participating in civic life, withdraw to a comfortable home, and take up gardening would have been considered faintly scandalous. You served Sparta until Sparta no longer needed your particular form of service, and then you served in an advisory capacity, and then you died. The concept of leisure as a reward for a life of labour simply did not map onto the Spartan worldview. Athens was considerably more ambivalent, which is fitting for a city that made a cultural virtue of ambivalence. Athenian democracy gave elderly male citizens the same vote as young ones, which was itself a radical statement about the ongoing relevance of older voices. The law courts, the assembly, the various boards and committees that ran the city's affairs were all theoretically open to elderly men who had the energy and inclination to participate, and many did. But participation was the key word. You earned your continued relevance by continuing to show up and contribute to public life. Simply being old was not in itself sufficient. The Greek philosophers, characteristically, could not agree on what old age actually meant. Plato in the Republic has the elderly Cephalus describe old age as a liberation from the tyrannies of appetite and passion. Finally, free from desire, you can devote yourself entirely to philosophy. Aristotle was considerably less romantic about it. In his rhetoric, he characterizes old men as cynical, small-minded, suspicious, and prone to complaint, a description that any ancient Greek comedy writer would have recognized immediately. The tension between these two views, old age as wisdom versus old age as decay, ran straight through Greek culture and has never entirely been resolved. What neither philosopher particularly addressed was the material reality of aging for people who were not wealthy enough to live off accumulated assets, not important enough to have a place in civic life, and not lucky enough to have reliable children. For those people, the majority of the population, Greek philosophy offered beautiful ideas and essentially no practical help. The old woman who had spent her life weaving, grinding grain and raising children had no seat in the assembly, no platonic dialogue on the dignity of her experience, and no pension. She had her family, the same as everyone else, and whatever the goddess happened to send. The Greeks gave us democracy, tragedy, and philosophy. They did not give us elder care policy, and the gap between those achievements is one of the more instructive silences in Western history. The medieval period offers one of history's clearest illustrations of what a world without retirement looks like at the ground level, and that illustration is not comfortable viewing. For the overwhelming majority of medieval Europeans, the peasants, the farmers, the tradespeople, the servants, there was no retirement age, no pension, no moment when the community collectively agreed that you had done enough and could rest. You worked as long as you could work. When your body began to fail, you worked less, or differently. When you could no longer work at all, you were dependent on your family, your community, or in the best case, the church. Monasteries and convents occasionally took in elderly people who could contribute small amounts of labour. Prayer counted, if nothing else, but the availability of this option was limited and came with its own set of conditions. Craft guilds sometimes made provisions for elderly members who had served long enough, offering small allowances or housing assistance, but these were informal, inconsistent, and applied to a tiny fraction of the population. For the vast majority, old age was not a reward for a life of work. It was just the final, hardest chapter of that same life. The specifics of medieval peasant life made the absence of any retirement structure feel even more punishing than the abstract description suggests. Consider what the body of a medieval agricultural labourer had actually been through by the time they reached, say, 50 years old. Decades of heavy physical work, often beginning in childhood. A diet that, while not always inadequate in calories, was chronically deficient in the kinds of nutrients that keep joints functional and immune systems robust. No dentistry, which meant years of untreated dental infections and the associated systemic health effects. Repeated pregnancies for women, each one a significant physical ordeal with no pain relief and limited medical support. The accumulated effects of cold, damp, and smoke, because medieval houses were essentially cold and damp with a smoking fire in the middle of them. By modern standards, a 50-year-old medieval peasant's body might be carrying damage equivalent to what we'd expect in someone considerably older, and they were expected to keep working through all of it. The manorial system, which organised agricultural life across much of medieval Europe, was not designed with the interests of ageing workers in mind. You owed labour to your lord, specific numbers of days per week on his land, in addition to working your own. This obligation did not diminish as you aged. A 60-year-old villager still owed the same labour dues as a 30-year-old, regardless of their physical capacity. If you couldn't fulfil them, your family was expected to provide the labour instead. The obligation transferred, but didn't disappear. You remained, in the eyes of the manorial system, a labour unit with specific obligations until you died. What softened this? where it was softened at all, was the informal texture of village life. Neighbours who helped each other, family networks that absorbed elderly members into the household, the occasional generosity of a lord or a parish priest. These weren't systems, they were relationships, and they were as variable as human relationships always are. Some elderly medieval people were warmly integrated into multi-generational households, their knowledge and experience genuinely valued. Others were neglected, hungry, and cold, surviving on the margins of communities that had very little margin to spare. The difference between these outcomes had more to do with luck, family, and geography than with any policy or principle. That was medieval retirement, in its entirety: luck, family, and geography. Sometimes it was enough, often it wasn't. For much of medieval history, the Catholic Church was the closest thing Europe had to a social welfare system, and this included, in limited ways, provision for the aged. Monasteries were not just religious institutions. They were economic powerhouses with vast landholdings, sophisticated agricultural operations, and a genuine obligation to provide for the poor. The concept of Christian charity meant that the elderly destitute had some claim on the Church's resources, not a guaranteed one, not a consistent one, but a claim nonetheless. Hospitals, which in the medieval period functioned more like hospices and poorhouses than medical facilities, often served elderly people alongside the sick and the dying. The Church also administered the almshouse, a charitable institution that provided housing and basic food to the elderly poor in exchange for prayer and good behaviour. If you had nothing and no family to fall back on, the almshouse was often your final option. Not comfortable, not private, frequently grim, but an option. The profound irony of this arrangement is that it was the Church's genuine moral framework, its insistence that the poor and the vulnerable deserved care, that kept alive the small ember of an idea that would eventually, centuries later, become the welfare state. The monastic tradition of hospitality, the rule of Saint Benedict, famously instructs monks to receive guests as Christ himself, created a network of institutions scattered across medieval Europe that provided food, shelter, and basic care to travellers, the sick, and the destitute. For elderly people with nowhere else to go, this network was sometimes genuinely life-saving. A traveller arriving at a monastery gate in genuine need could, in theory, expect to be fed and sheltered. Whether they could expect to stay indefinitely was a different question, one that depended on the resources of the specific monastery and the disposition of its abbot. More formalised were the arrangements that wealthy medieval people made to secure care in their old age. The practice of purchasing a corrody, essentially a medieval annuity from a monastery, was common among those who could afford it. You paid a lump sum to the monastery, and in return you received a guaranteed daily allowance of food and drink, sometimes a room, and the promise of prayers for your soul after you died. It was a transaction, not charity. The monastery got capital, you got security. It was also, from the monastery's perspective, a calculation. You were betting that you'd live long enough to get your money's worth. They were betting that you wouldn't. Medieval monks were apparently quite comfortable with this kind of actuarial thinking. For those without the resources to buy a corrody, the almshouse, often called a hospital in the medieval sense, though medical treatment was rarely its primary function, was the institution of last resort. Run by the Church, funded by charitable donations, and staffed by religious brothers and sisters, almshouses provided bed, board, and spiritual care to a limited number of elderly and infirm residents. The conditions varied enormously. Some were genuinely comfortable, well-funded institutions that provided a dignified final chapter. Others were overcrowded, underfunded, and grim in ways that discouraged potential residents from seeking admission, except as an absolute last resort. Either way, demand always exceeded supply. The Church could not save everyone, and it didn't try to. What it did was maintain the principle, stubbornly, across centuries of institutional transformation, that the old and the helpless deserved something. That principle, preserved in almshouses and corrodies, and the rule of St. Benedict was the thread connecting medieval charity to the modern welfare state. It's a thinner thread than we might like, but it held. In the cities and towns of medieval and early modern Europe, skilled craftsmen organised themselves into guilds, formal associations that controlled training, quality, wages, and working conditions for their members, and embedded within these structures were, in embryonic form, some of the earliest mutual aid provisions in Western history. Guilds collected dues from their members and used those funds to support sick, injured or elderly brothers who could no longer work. A master craftsman who had spent 40 years at his trade and contributed faithfully to the guild's coffers could, in theory, expect some form of support in his declining years, not lavish, but something. The key word is theory. Guild provisions for elderly members varied enormously by trade, by city, and by the financial health of the organisation. A prosperous guild in a wealthy trading city might provide genuine support. A struggling guild in a small town might have little to offer beyond sympathy. And these protections applied only to guild members, which meant only to skilled craftsmen in recognised trades. Farmers, servants, labourers, and the vast majority of working people had no access to any such system whatsoever. The guild's internal economy was built on a principle that would later become central to every social insurance system. The active subsidise the inactive. Working craftsmen paid dues. Those dues supported members who could no longer work due to illness, injury, or old age. This was not framed as charity, it was framed as fraternal obligation, as the mutual responsibility of brothers in a craft. The social fiction that made it work was that any member might one day need the support of the others, and therefore everyone had a stake in the system's solvency. Sound familiar? It should. This is essentially the logic of modern social insurance, arrived at not by political philosophers, but by medieval leather tanners and cloth merchants trying to figure out how to take care of their own. The guild's provisions for elderly members typically included a small weekly payment from the common fund, sometimes access to guild-owned housing for widows and retired masters, and the guarantee of a proper funeral and burial, not a trivial benefit in an era when a pauper's grave was a genuine source of social shame. Some guilds maintained dedicated almshouses for retired members, small clusters of housing adjacent to their guild hall, where elderly craftsmen could live out their final years in the company of people who had shared their trade and their working lives. Others simply made cash payments. The specifics varied, but the underlying principle, that membership in the guild created obligations that ran in both directions, obligations that outlasted active working capacity, was remarkably consistent. The fatal weakness of the system was its narrowness. To benefit from guild welfare, you had to be in a guild. To be in a guild, you had to be a recognised master in an established trade, which required completing a formal apprenticeship, then years of journeyman work, then the production of a masterpiece, literally, a piece of work submitted for the guild's approval, and finally election or admission to the guild. Women were excluded from most guilds entirely, with a handful of notable exceptions in trades like silk weaving. Rural workers, casual labourers, servants, the majority of the working population, had no access to guild membership and therefore no access to guild welfare. The system was genuinely innovative and genuinely effective for the people it covered. It just didn't cover very many people. The gap between the guild members and everyone else was the gap that governments would eventually slowly and very reluctantly be forced to fill. While Europe was muddling through with guild provisions and church charity, Imperial China had developed something considerably more structured, not quite retirement in the modern sense, but a formal, codified acknowledgement that the elderly deserved specific consideration. Confucian philosophy, which formed the backbone of Chinese social and political thought for over 2 millennia, placed filial piety, respect for and care of one's elders, at the absolute centre of moral life. This wasn't just advice. Under the Tang and Song dynasties, it was written into law. children who failed to provide adequately for aging parents faced serious legal penalties. The state also made provisions for elderly officials who had served in the bureaucracy. Retirement from active service with a portion of their salary was formalised, and officials above a certain rank could expect to be supported in their old age. For the scholar gentry class, there was something recognisable as a pension system operating in China well before any equivalent structure appeared in Europe. For the peasantry, the story was, as always, considerably less encouraging. The family remained the primary safety net, and if that net had holes, there was very little else to catch you. The Confucian framework around aging was philosophically sophisticated in ways that still hold up remarkably well. The Analects describe 5 cardinal relationships, and the relationship between parent and child is among the most sacred. But Confucian filial piety wasn't simply about obedience or obligation. It was about genuine reverence, about the idea that parents had given children something so fundamental, so irreplaceable, that nothing a child could do would fully repay it. This framing transformed care of the elderly from a burden into an honour, from a duty into an expression of one's own moral character. How you treated your aging parents was considered one of the clearest indicators of the kind of person you actually were. A man who neglected his parents wasn't just a bad son, he was, by definition, a bad official, a bad neighbour, a bad citizen. The Tang Code, one of the great legal compilations of imperial China, made these obligations explicit and enforceable. A child who struck a parent could be executed. A child who failed to provide food and clothing for an elderly parent could be sentenced to hard labour. A child who left home while a parent was sick without obtaining special permission was in legal jeopardy. These weren't abstract moral prescriptions, they were laws with teeth, enforced by a sophisticated bureaucratic state that took the welfare of the elderly seriously enough to put it in the legal code. For the official class, the Confucian bureaucrats who administered the empire, formal retirement provisions were established that had no real equivalent in the West until the 19th century. High officials were expected to retire from active government service at 70, with a pension of half their official salary. They were then expected to live out their remaining years in dignified withdrawal, offering advice when asked, participating in the literary and intellectual life of their region, and serving as moral exemplars to the community. This was not simply stopping work. It was a recognised social role with its own conventions, its own literature and its own prestige. The retired official writing poetry in his garden, surrounded by grandchildren, at peace with the world, this was a cultural ideal that shaped Chinese attitudes toward ageing for centuries. It was available only to a small elite, but as cultural ideals go, it pointed in an interesting direction, toward the idea that the end of a working life could be something other than a slow, undignified decline. Traditional Japanese culture developed its own distinctive relationship with old age and withdrawal from active life, and it looked quite different from either the Chinese model or what we'd recognise today. The concept of inkyo, a formal retirement from the headship of a household, and the transfer of that role to one's son or heir, was practiced among merchant families and landowners for centuries. This wasn't idle leisure. An inkyo elder remained present, remained involved, remained influential, but formally stepped back from the visible role of family decision-maker. They occupied a kind of honoured shadow position, respected, consulted, but no longer officially in charge. In some ways, this was more sophisticated than anything the Western world had developed. It acknowledged the reality that the transition of power within a family needed to be managed, not just waited out, and it gave older people a graceful way to step back without simply being discarded. But it was a system for people who had something to hand over: property, a business, a household. For those who had nothing to transfer, inkyo was irrelevant. You simply worked until you couldn't. The mechanics of inkyo were precise and culturally serious. When a merchant or landowner decided to formally retire, and the decision was his to make, not the family's, there was a recognised ceremony of transfer. The household registration changed. The son's name moved to the head of the document. The father received a formal title signalling his new status. The retired head, the elder, the one who had stepped aside. This wasn't a demotion, or at least it wasn't supposed to feel like one. It was a graduation into a different kind of authority. The authority of experience rather than administration, of counsel rather than command. What made Inkyo genuinely interesting and genuinely different from the Western experience was the physical arrangement it often involved. Wealthy families would sometimes build a small secondary structure on the family compound, a retirement cottage, essentially, where the Inkyo elder and their spouse could live quietly, separated from the noise and business of the main household, but still part of the family's daily life. This was not banishment. It was proximity without the burden of running things. The elder could walk across the garden to participate in family meals, offer advice on a tricky business decision, watch the grandchildren grow up. But they could also close their door and be alone in a way that the head of an active household rarely managed. It was, by the standards of any era, a rather elegant solution to the problem of aging within a family structure. The tension in the Inkyo system, and there was always tension, ran in both directions. Sons who were waiting for their inheritance found the formal transfer of authority both relieving and frightening. Running the household was now their responsibility, with all the risk that implied. Fathers who had handed over control sometimes struggled with the psychological reality of no longer being in charge, particularly if the son made decisions they disagreed with but could no longer override. The literature of the Edo period is full of stories about Inkyo elders who kept interfering, who couldn't quite let go, who found the honoured shadow position less satisfying in practice than it had seemed in theory. Sound like anyone you know? For the vast majority of Japanese people who had no property to transfer and no family compound to retire to, none of this applied. Farmers worked their fields. Fishermen worked their boats. Servants served. The Inkyo system was the retirement of the propertied classes, elegant and thoughtfully designed, and it remained entirely invisible to everyone below a certain level of economic security. Japan wouldn't develop anything approaching a universal retirement system until the 20th century, when industrialization created the same pressures it had created everywhere else. Until then, the majority of Japanese people aged out of their most productive work the same way people did everywhere. Gradually, without ceremony, and with whatever support their families could manage. The idea of a regular, ongoing payment made specifically to support people in their non-working years has to start somewhere, and historians have traced some of the earliest recognizable examples to the Roman Empire's treatment of its civil servants and military veterans. What made the Roman approach distinctive, at least in its most developed forms under the Principate, was that it was systematic, not ad hoc. It was administered by the state, funded by a dedicated military treasury established by Augustus, and it created an explicit expectation: serve long enough, survive long enough, and you will receive ongoing support. This was enormously significant as a concept, even if the execution was imperfect. The funding was periodically chaotic, and the amounts received often weren't enough to live on comfortably without supplementing them with other work. The critical shift was philosophical. The state was acknowledging a responsibility to people who had served it, even after that service had ended. That idea, the notion that labour creates a claim, that service earns something more than wages, is the intellectual seed from which every modern pension system eventually grew. Augustus established the aerarium militare in the year 6 of the Common Era, funding it initially with a substantial personal gift, 170 million sesterces of his own money, and then with a 5% inheritance tax on Roman citizens and a 1% sales tax. The political messaging was deliberate. This fund was separate from the general treasury, protected from the annual budget fights, and dedicated exclusively to veteran support. You couldn't raid it to pay for a road or a temple or a foreign campaign. It was the soldiers' money, held in trust by the state, and that separateness was meant to make the promise credible in a way that previous informal assurances had not been. The veteran who collected his premia after 25 years of service received the equivalent of roughly 3,000 denarii, a substantial sum, though not a fortune. What he did with it varied enormously. Some veterans bought land, either in the colonies Rome established for that purpose, or back in their home region if they'd maintained any connection to it. Some set themselves up as small traders or craftsmen. Some drank through it with impressive efficiency and ended up in poverty within a few years. The lump sum model had obvious limitations. It transferred all the planning risk to the individual and provided no ongoing protection against the simple fact of living longer than your money lasted. What made the Roman system genuinely important was not its generosity. By modern standards, it was quite modest, but what it implied about the relationship between an individual and the state. The Roman soldier gave the state 25 years of his life. He went where the state sent him, fought who the state told him to fight, endured conditions that would be considered extraordinary hardship by any standard. In exchange, the state owed him something specific and calculable, not just the wages he was paid during service. That was compensation for current work, but something additional, a recognition that the years he'd given could not be fully compensated in real time, and that the debt ran past his discharge date. This idea that certain kinds of service create obligations that extend beyond the period of service itself is the conceptual engine of every pension system ever built. The Romans didn't call it retirement. They didn't have a word for it. But they invented the logic, and the logic has never gone away. The Renaissance, that gloriously complicated period when Europe rediscovered classical learning, invented perspective painting, and started dressing in extraordinary hats, also produced a fascinating evolution in how wealthy people planned for their old age. For the prosperous merchants, bankers, and landowners of 15th and 16th century Italy, old age was something you could, with sufficient foresight and wealth, actually prepare for, not through pensions or state support, those didn't exist, but through the strategic deployment of assets, charitable donations, and carefully constructed wills. Placing money with a convent or monastery in exchange for care in old age was a recognised arrangement. Entering a confraternity, a religious brotherhood that provided mutual support to its members, offered another layer of protection. And for the truly wealthy, simply having enough property and income-generating assets to support oneself without labour was the goal. This was not retirement in the democratic sense. It was the retirement of the privileged class, available only to those who had accumulated enough to live off their holdings and utterly out of reach for the vast majority. But it established a cultural template, the idea that the purpose of accumulating wealth, in part, was to eventually free yourself from the necessity of labour. The Florentine merchant class of the 15th century was extraordinarily sophisticated about financial planning, including financial planning for old age. The same mercantile networks that financed international trade, managed currency exchange across European capitals, and invented double-entry bookkeeping were also being used to think carefully about personal financial security across a lifespan. Merchants drafted wills with remarkable precision, establishing trusts, endowments, and charitable foundations that served multiple purposes at once. They provided for their families, secured prayers for their souls, and often included provisions for their own maintenance in old age. The confraternity system deserves particular attention because it represents, in miniature, the same mutual aid logic that the guilds had developed for craftsmen, now applied to a broader cross-section of urban society. Florentine confraternities, and there were dozens of them, organised around neighbourhoods, devotions to particular saints, or shared occupational identities, collected dues from members and used those funds to support sick, bereaved, or elderly brothers and their families. They also provided social connection, spiritual community, and the reassurance of not being alone in navigating misfortune. For a wealthy merchant, joining several confraternities simultaneously was a completely normal diversification strategy, spreading the risk and multiplying the connections. It was networking with a charitable veneer and a genuine safety net underneath. What the Renaissance also produced for the first time in Western culture at any meaningful scale was the idea of the learned retirement, the notion that wealthy men who had finished their active business careers might spend their final years in studious leisure, reading the classics, writing memoirs, corresponding with humanist scholars, cultivating their gardens and their souls. This was not merely an aspiration, it was a recognised social type, celebrated in literature and philosophy. The retired Florentine merchant sitting in his villa surrounded by his library and his grandchildren, at peace with the world, this image was genuinely new. It required money, obviously. It required good health, which was not guaranteed. And it required the particular cultural moment of the Italian Renaissance, with its enthusiasm for classical models of the philosopher in retirement. But it planted something in the Western imagination that would eventually grow into the modern concept of retirement as a reward, as a deserved chapter of ease and self-cultivation. The mass version of that vision was still 4 centuries away. The seed was already in the ground. England's Poor Laws, beginning with the Elizabethan Poor Law of 1601, represent one of the first formal acknowledgements by a national government that some portion of the population would always be unable to support itself, and that this was a social problem requiring a systematic response rather than simply a personal failing requiring prayer. The elderly poor were explicitly included in the categories of people the Poor Laws were designed to address. Each parish was responsible for supporting its own impotent poor, a term that included the aged, the disabled, and the chronically sick. Overseers of the poor collected local taxes and distributed relief to those deemed eligible. This was not comfortable support. It was minimal, humiliating, and subject to constant local variation and discretion. The workhouse, which became increasingly central to poor law administration in the 19th century, was deliberately designed to be less appealing than independent labour, the famous principle of less eligibility, which meant that elderly people who ended up there did so as an absolute last resort. But for all its grimness, the poor law system represented something genuinely new, a legally enforceable obligation of the community to the destitute elderly. The seed was small and bitter, but it was planted. Before the Poor Laws, poor relief in England was almost entirely the responsibility of the Church, administered through parish priests funded by voluntary charitable donations, distributed at the discretion of whoever happened to be in charge of the local almshouse. When Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries between 1536 and 1541, he didn't just seize a lot of valuable property, he also destroyed most of the institutional infrastructure that had been providing food, shelter, and care to the destitute elderly for centuries. The monastery was gone. The almshouse it ran was gone. The corrody agreements that had guaranteed care to dozens of elderly people were voided overnight. And the government that had done this had no particular plan for replacing any of it. The resulting crisis took decades to become impossible to ignore, and several more decades of legislative tinkering before the Elizabethan Poor Law of 1601 pulled together a reasonably coherent national framework. The law assigned responsibility for poor relief to the parish, the smallest unit of English local government, and required each parish to appoint overseers of the poor, who would assess local need and levy a compulsory poor rate on local property owners to fund relief. This was the critical step, making poor relief a tax obligation rather than a charitable choice. You could choose not to donate to the church poor box. You could not choose not to pay the poor rate without running into legal difficulties. The state had decided that poverty was a collective problem requiring a collective solution, and it was going to fund that solution through compulsion. The workhouse test, the principle that anyone seeking relief should be required to enter the workhouse and perform labour in exchange for support, was introduced more formally in the 19th century and applied to the elderly with a callousness that is difficult to read about without some discomfort. An elderly person who had worked their entire life, whose children were dead or absent or too poor to help, who had no savings and no home, could be required to enter an institution designed to be as unpleasant as possible, sleep in a ward with strangers, eat minimal food, perform whatever light labour they could manage, and be separated from their spouse if married. Families were split at the workhouse gate. This was not an accident, it was policy, designed to deter dependency. The people designing it were not monsters. They were economists operating under the genuine belief that making relief too comfortable would destroy the incentive to work and produce a permanent dependent class. They were also applied to elderly people who had no ability to return to work regardless of incentives, profoundly wrong. The moral argument for replacing this system with something better was building pressure for decades before it finally found its political moment. If the history of retirement has a villain, it is the 19th century factory. Not because factory owners were uniquely cruel, though many were, but because industrialization created a specific, novel form of misery for aging workers that agricultural life had, in a strange way, been slightly more forgiving about. On a farm, an older person whose strength had diminished could still perform useful tasks scaled to their capacity. Lighter work, supervisory roles, the kind of accumulated knowledge that made you useful in different ways as your physical abilities declined. The factory didn't work like that. The factory needed consistent output, consistent speed, and consistent physical endurance. If you couldn't keep pace with the production line, you were a liability, and the industrial labour market was brutally efficient about removing liabilities. Workers in their 50s and 60s found themselves increasingly unable to compete with younger workers for factory jobs, pushed into casual labour, dependent on their children, or simply destitute. This created a social crisis on a scale that the parish poor law system was completely unprepared to handle. The transition from agricultural to industrial labour was not just a change in the type of work being done, it was a restructuring of the entire relationship between human bodies and economic production. Agriculture was, for all its brutality, an organic system. The seasons imposed rhythms, tasks varied. A 70-year-old farmer who could no longer swing a scythe could still sow seeds, tend animals, supervise younger workers, pass on knowledge accumulated over decades of working specific fields in specific conditions. Their experience was locally irreplaceable. The farm absorbed older bodies into its rhythms because it had to, because the knowledge those bodies carried was part of what made the farm functional. The factory had no interest in accumulated local knowledge. It had no interest in adaptation, flexibility, or the gradual scaling down of tasks. It was a machine, and it needed the people inside it to behave like components. The pace was set by the machinery, not by the workers. The tasks were specified, repetitive, and physically demanding in specific ways, standing for 12 hours, lifting, carrying, maintaining concentration under noise and heat. A worker who slowed down didn't just affect their own output, they slowed the entire production line. The pressure to maintain pace was relentless, and the consequence of failing to maintain it was immediate. You were replaced. What this created, across the industrial cities of Britain, France, Germany, and eventually the United States, was a new demographic of misery, the displaced industrial worker. These were people who had spent 20 or 30 years in physically demanding factory work that had damaged their bodies in specific occupational ways, and who found themselves, in their 50s or early 60s, unable to continue at the required pace and unable to find any alternative employment that paid enough to live on. They were too worn out to do industrial work and had spent their entire adult lives doing industrial work, which meant they had no agricultural skills to fall back on and no craft knowledge to apply. The casual labour market, day labour, street work, whatever you could find, absorbed some of them, but at wages that made survival marginal. Their children, if they had them, and if the children were employed, might help. The workhouse was the alternative. Neither was what anyone would describe as a retirement. The scale of this suffering eventually became politically visible in ways that the dispersed rural poverty of earlier eras never quite had. Industrial workers lived in cities, in concentrated communities, where poverty was observable in ways that scattered rural destitution was not. They organised slowly, painfully against fierce resistance into unions and political movements that began to articulate demands not just for better wages and shorter hours, but for protection in old age. The idea that a worker who had given 30 years to an industry was owed something when those years ran out, that was gaining traction. The only question was whether the industry or the state would be the one to provide it. Here it is. The moment someone actually invented retirement, deliberately, for reasons that had almost nothing to do with compassion and almost everything to do with politics. In 1889, Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor of Germany, introduced the old age and disability insurance law, the world's first national pension system. Workers paid into the scheme throughout their working lives, employers contributed, and workers who reached the age of 70 and were no longer able to work would receive a small pension from the state. This was genuinely revolutionary. But Bismarck's motivation was not benevolence, it was preemptive. The German socialist movement was growing rapidly, offering workers a radical alternative vision of society. Bismarck, who despised socialism, calculated that if the state offered workers concrete material benefits, something to lose if the revolution came, they might be less enthusiastic about revolutionary politics. Give the workers a stake in the system, and they defend the system. It was, as political calculations go, extremely clever. The fact that it also happened to be good for elderly workers was, from Bismarck's perspective, a side effect. Bismarck was not, by any measure, a soft man. He had unified Germany through a combination of diplomatic cunning and calculated military aggression. He had expelled the Jesuits, broken the Catholic Church's political power in Germany, and manoeuvred 3 separate wars to achieve his strategic objectives. He referred to his political philosophy as realpolitik, politics based on practical realities rather than moral ideals, and he meant it. When he introduced social insurance legislation in the 1880s, he did so with the explicit statement that he wanted to give workers something that would make them grateful to the state, rather than susceptible to socialist agitation. He said this out loud, in Parliament. He was not embarrassed about it. The sequence of Bismarck's social insurance laws is worth noting, because it reveals the logic of the enterprise. First came accident insurance in 1884, covering workers injured on the job. Then came health insurance in 1883. Then, last of all, old age and disability insurance in 1889. The political calculation behind the ordering was clear. Start with benefits that workers could see themselves needing immediately: injury, illness, and work up to the more abstract provision for old age, which required workers to make contributions for decades before seeing any return. Each law was passed over fierce opposition from both conservatives, who thought state welfare would undermine individual responsibility, and socialists, who recognised Bismarck's strategy perfectly well and resented being outmanoeuvred. The system that emerged was a genuine innovation in how states related to their citizens. Workers and employers made compulsory contributions to an insurance fund. The contributions were not voluntary. You were enrolled whether you wanted to be or not, and your employer was required to match your payment. This was not charity. It was insurance, and the language of insurance was deliberate. You were not receiving a handout from the state. You were collecting on a policy you'd paid for over your working life. This framing was politically essential, because the idea of state charity was deeply unpopular in a culture that associated it with failure and dependency. But insurance, that was prudent. That was rational. That was the kind of thing a responsible person did. Bismarck had invented not just a pension system, but a way of talking about pension systems that made them culturally acceptable. Every subsequent retirement system in the industrialized world has operated within the rhetorical framework he constructed. We are still, in a very real sense, living inside Bismarck's argument. When Bismarck set the German pension eligibility age at 70, he was not being generous, he was being clever, and the arithmetic was straightforward. In 1889 Germany, average life expectancy was somewhere around 45 years, dragged down heavily by high rates of infant and child mortality. Most people who survived to adulthood and made it through the working years of their life could expect to live into their 50s or 60s, but reaching 70 was genuinely uncommon. Setting the pension age at 70 meant that the system was designed to provide for a relatively small proportion of the population, those who were truly old, truly worn out, and had beaten very long odds simply by surviving. The pension was not meant to fund a comfortable decade or two of leisure. It was meant to provide a minimal safety net for the final, fragile years of the very old. The gap between the eligibility age and the average lifespan meant that the system was, by design, relatively cheap to run. Future generations of legislators looking at Bismarck's invention would note this aspect with great interest, and the tension between pension sustainability and actual human lifespans would become one of the defining policy debates of the 20th century. To understand why 70 was such a convenient number, you need to understand something about how average life expectancy statistics actually work. And this is where a lot of modern commentary about historical aging goes wrong in ways that really matter. When historians say that average life expectancy in 1889 Germany was around 45 years, that number is doing a lot of statistical work that obscures an important reality. That average included enormous numbers of people who died in infancy and early childhood, deaths that dragged the average down dramatically. If you stripped out infant and child mortality and asked specifically, among Germans who survived to adulthood, how long could they expect to live? The answer was considerably longer. A German worker who made it to 25 in 1889 might reasonably expect to live into their late 50s or early 60s. A significant minority made it to 70 or beyond. Bismarck and his advisors knew this. The actuarial calculations behind the law were not naive. They knew they were setting the eligibility age at a level that would exclude most workers, not because most workers died young in the aggregate sense, but because most workers who survived to working age still didn't make it to 70. The combination of occupational hazard, inadequate nutrition, limited medical care and accumulated physical wear meant that reaching 70 as a manual labourer was a genuine achievement. Bismarck was offering a pension to the very old survivors, and he was doing so at a price that the contribution rates could reasonably sustain. The eligibility age was lowered to 65 in Germany in 1916, partly in recognition that the original 70 was widely seen as a political joke, a pension that most workers would never live to collect, and partly in response to the genuine suffering of workers in their mid-60s who were too worn out to continue but not yet eligible for support. The shift from 70 to 65 established the standard that most of the industrialized world would eventually adopt, not because 65 had any particular physiological significance, but because it had become the conventional answer to a conventional question. The logic of Bismarck's original calculation set the age high enough that the system remains affordable, but not so high that workers stop believing the promise is real, has haunted every subsequent discussion of pension age ever since. Every time a government proposes raising the retirement age, they are having the same argument Bismarck had with himself in 1889. The numbers have changed. The underlying tension has not. If any culture was philosophically resistant to the concept of retirement, it was the United States. The American mythology of self-reliance, the Protestant work ethic, the pioneer ideal of the rugged individual who never stops, all of it combined to create a cultural atmosphere in which ceasing to work felt, to many Americans, like a kind of moral failure. Well into the 19th century, the prevailing American attitude toward the elderly poor was largely that their poverty was their own fault, the result of insufficient industry, insufficient thrift, or insufficient virtue. Almshouses existed but were deliberately uncomfortable. The assumption was that anyone who ended up there had made bad choices and shouldn't be rewarded for them. Fraternal organisations and veterans groups provided mutual aid to their members, but coverage was fragmentary and the benefits minimal. It wasn't until the scale of industrial-age poverty among the elderly became impossible to ignore. An estimated 1/3 of all Americans over 65 lived in poverty by the early 20th century that the political will to do something systematic began to build. The ideological resistance to retirement in America ran deep enough to have its own respectable intellectual tradition. Benjamin Franklin, perhaps the most famous American success story of the 18th century, worked essentially until he died, and he died at 84, which in 1790 was an extraordinary age. The image of Franklin as perpetually industrious, perpetually curious, perpetually useful, was not incidental to his cultural status. It was central to it. The idea that a truly virtuous person simply never stopped being productive, never voluntarily withdrew from the world of useful activity, was embedded in the founding mythology of the Republic in ways that made systematic retirement feel vaguely un-American. This cultural attitude had real and painful consequences. It meant that elderly Americans who could no longer work tended to be seen as personal failures rather than social problems. The county poorhouse, America's equivalent of the English workhouse, was deliberately stigmatized, associated with waste and improvidence, a place where people ended up because they hadn't saved, hadn't planned, hadn't worked hard enough or smart enough. The fact that many of the people who ended up there had worked extremely hard for decades at work that simply didn't pay enough to save from was an inconvenient complication that the prevailing ideology preferred not to dwell on. What gradually shifted the conversation was the scale of the problem and the visibility of its victims. By the early 20th century, American cities were full of elderly workers who had been displaced by industrial change. Men and women who had spent their working lives in industries that no longer needed them, whose savings had been wiped out by economic panics, whose children were struggling in their own right. Progressive reformers, settlement house workers, and labour organisers began documenting this misery in ways that were impossible to dismiss as individual failure. A survey of Massachusetts workers in 1910 found that only 35% of men over 65 were economically self-sufficient. The rest were dependent on children, charity, or the poorhouse. These were not lazy people. These were not improvident people. These were people who had worked hard and been failed by a system that had no room for them once they couldn't keep up. The argument that this was their fault was losing credibility faster than the political establishment was comfortable acknowledging. Before Social Security, before any national retirement system, the United States ran one of the largest pension programs in the world, one that almost nobody remembers today. The Civil War pension system, established after the war to support Union veterans and their survivors, expanded dramatically in the decades following 1865 until, by the 1890s, it consumed nearly 40% of the entire federal budget. At its peak, nearly 1 million veterans received pensions, and the eligibility criteria had been loosened enough that essentially any Union veteran who could demonstrate some disability, however tangentially related to their service, qualified. This was not a rational welfare policy. It was a political machine lubricated by pension money. The Grand Army of the Republic, the Union Veterans Organization, was one of the most powerful lobbying groups in American political life, and politicians competed vigorously for their support. What the Civil War pension system demonstrated, accidentally and expensively, was that a large-scale government transfer of income to an aging population was administratively possible. The machinery existed. What it lacked was universality. The origins of the Civil War pension were uncontroversial enough. Men who'd been wounded in service and could no longer support themselves needed support. This was the same logic that had animated the Roman Premier, just applied to a democratic republic that had just fought an enormously destructive war. The Pension Bureau was established, pension agents were hired, and claims were processed. In the immediate post-war years, the system was relatively modest and relatively targeted, genuinely disabled veterans receiving payments calibrated to the severity of their injuries. This seemed reasonable. Nobody was going to argue against supporting men who'd lost limbs at Gettysburg or Antietam. The trouble or the political opportunity, depending on how you looked at it, was that the Republican Party had built much of its electoral coalition around Union veterans, and veterans were a large and organised constituency with strong feelings about pension generosity. The Dependent Pension Act of 1890, signed by President Benjamin Harrison over the objections of fiscal conservatives, transformed the system entirely. It extended pension eligibility to any Union veteran who was unable to support himself by manual labour, regardless of whether the disability was connected to military service. Age itself, treated as a disability, eventually became sufficient qualification. A man who had served in the Union Army 30 years earlier and was now 60 years old and finding physical labour difficult could qualify. The pension rolls exploded. The regional politics of the Civil War pension created one of the more remarkable disparities in American history. The system covered Union veterans, which meant it covered the North, overwhelmingly. Confederate veterans received nothing from the federal government, and Southern states established their own, far more modest pension programs from depleted state treasuries. The result was a de facto regional welfare system that provided meaningful income support to aging men in the North, while leaving aging men in the South almost entirely without protection. This disparity shaped attitudes toward federal social spending in ways that would still be visible 50 years later when Franklin Roosevelt was trying to pass Social Security. The memory of a federal pension system that had benefited the North exclusively was one of the reasons Southern legislators were so resistant to national welfare programs, and one of the reasons they extracted the exclusions that made the original Social Security Act so racially inequitable. History, as always, was paying forward. The Great Depression did to the American conversation about retirement what Bismarck had done to the German one, but at a completely different emotional register. It made the need for a universal system so viscerally, undeniably obvious that even the most ardent advocates of self-reliance had difficulty arguing against it. By 1933, unemployment was above 25%, and elderly Americans were among the most desperate. Savings wiped out by bank failures, homes lost, children too poor to support parents who had once supported them. The Depression created a generation of elderly poor on a scale that overwhelmed every existing charitable and local relief mechanism. Into this crisis stepped, among others, Francis Townsend, a California physician who proposed the Townsend Plan, a monthly pension of $200 to every American over 60, funded by a national sales tax, on the condition that recipients spend the entire amount each month. The economics were dubious. The politics were electric. Tens of millions of Americans signed petitions in support of the Townsend Plan, and it frightened the Roosevelt administration enough to accelerate serious work on what would become the Social Security Act. The Great Depression didn't just create poverty, it destroyed a specific ideological argument. The argument, dominant in American culture for over a century, was that poverty in old age was the result of individual failure, insufficient thrift, insufficient industry, insufficient prudence over a working lifetime. That argument could survive isolated cases, even large numbers of isolated cases, because each one could be explained away with reference to specific personal failings. It could not survive a situation in which the entire banking system had collapsed, wiping out the savings of millions of people who had done everything right, who had worked hard, saved diligently, and planned carefully, and ended up destitute anyway through no fault of their own. When the failure was systemic, the explanation couldn't be individual. The Townsend Plan was economically unworkable. Economists who analysed it in 1934 concluded that $200 a month to every American over 60 would cost more than the entire national income, but it captured something real about the scale of the problem and the desperation of its victims. Dr. Townsend, who had himself lost his life savings in the Depression and witnessed elderly patients in his California community reduced to scavenging through garbage cans for food, was not a professional politician or a trained economist. He was a general practitioner with a flair for moral outrage and an instinct for simple solutions to complex problems. The simplicity of his proposal, everyone over 60 gets $200, no means test, no complicated eligibility criteria, no bureaucracy deciding who deserves what. was both its economic weakness and its political strength. People understood it immediately, and they responded to it with the fervour of people who had been waiting a long time for someone to say that the problem was serious and the solution was straightforward. Roosevelt watched the Townsend movement grow and drew the correct political conclusion. If the administration didn't produce its own retirement security proposal, something considerably less fiscally manageable might get forced on it by popular pressure. The Committee on Economic Security was convened in 1934, tasked with designing a workable system. They worked quickly, under significant pressure, and produced the framework of what would become the Social Security Act of 1935. The Townsend Plan was never passed. Social Security was, and the elderly Americans who had spent the Depression years eating less and worrying more had, in a roundabout way, by frightening the political establishment with the spectre of something more radical, produced the most durable social program in American history. When Franklin Roosevelt signed the Social Security Act in August 1935, he was not creating a gift, he was creating an insurance program, and the distinction was deliberate. Roosevelt, politically shrewd and philosophically cautious, understood that Americans would resist the idea of a government handout to the elderly. But an insurance program, something you paid into, something you earned the right to collect, that was different. That was thrift. That was responsibility. We put those payroll contributions there so as to give the contributors a legal, moral, and political right to collect their pensions, Roosevelt reportedly said. With those taxes in there, no damn politician can ever scrap my Social Security program. The initial Social Security Act was modest. Workers in commerce and industry paid into the system. Employers matched their contributions, and workers who reached 65 could collect monthly benefits. Many workers, including most domestic workers and agricultural labourers who were disproportionately black, were explicitly excluded. The benefit amounts were small, but the principle was established, the infrastructure was built, and Social Security would be expanded repeatedly in the decades that followed. The first person to ever collect a Social Security benefit was a woman named Ida Mae Fuller of Ludlow, Vermont. She had worked as a legal secretary, paid into the system for 3 years, and contributed a total of $24.75 before retiring in 1939. Her first monthly check was $22.54. She lived to be 100 years old, collecting nearly $23,000 in total benefits over her lifetime. The actuaries had not modelled for Ida Mae Fuller. She became, depending on your political perspective, either the perfect embodiment of Social Security's promise or the perfect illustration of its long-term fiscal challenges. Possibly both. The political architecture Roosevelt built around Social Security was as carefully constructed as the program itself. By insisting on the contributory structure, workers pay in, workers collect. He was doing something more than designing a financing mechanism. He was creating a psychological and political ownership that no means-tested welfare program could replicate. If Social Security had been structured as a tax-funded payment to the poor elderly, which is what it functionally resembled in its early years, it would have been politically vulnerable to the argument that it was charity, that it created dependency, that it should be cut when budgets were tight. But because workers paid in throughout their careers, because they received a card and a statement and an accumulated record of their contributions, it felt like something they owned. Cutting it felt like theft. This was entirely deliberate, and it worked with remarkable durability. The exclusions written into the original act are a darker part of the story, and one that gets less attention than it deserves. Agricultural and domestic workers, the categories that most comprehensively covered the black workforce in the Jim Crow South, were excluded from coverage in a concession to Southern Democratic legislators who made their support for the New Deal contingent on not disrupting the racial labor hierarchy of their region. This was not an oversight. It was a negotiated decision made by people who knew exactly what they were doing and who understood that building a coalition for reform sometimes meant accepting terms that were morally indefensible. The workers who were excluded from Social Security were often the ones who had worked the hardest, under the most difficult conditions, with the least compensation, and who needed the protection most. They would wait decades for full inclusion. In the meantime, they aged without it, relying on family and charity and whatever remained after a lifetime of work that the system had decided wasn't worth protecting. In the decades following World War II, retirement in America was transformed from a grim last resort into something approaching an aspiration, and the transformation was fast enough to feel almost surreal in retrospect. Company pensions expanded dramatically as part of the post-war labour settlement between unions and corporations. Social security benefits were increased. Medicare was established in 1965, removing the catastrophic risk of medical costs in old age. And crucially, the economy was growing fast enough, and the demographic balance was favourable enough, that the math all seemed to work. Retirement communities began to appear. Del Webb opened Sun City, Arizona in 1960. A planned community designed exclusively for adults over 55, and it sold out almost immediately. The image of retirement as a reward, as a deserved chapter of leisure and travel and golf, as the thing you work toward, that image crystallized in this period. For the first time in human history, millions of ordinary working people could genuinely expect to spend a decade or more of their lives in something resembling ease. The ancient default, work until you drop, had been overturned, at least for a significant portion of the population. Sun City deserves a moment of genuine appreciation because it represented something that had never quite existed before. A place designed specifically for the idea that old people might want to have fun. The concept was not obvious. Del Webb, the developer, wasn't sure it would work. His own business partners were skeptical that anyone would want to live in a community with no children, no young people, nothing but other retirees. They were spectacularly wrong. On opening day in January 1960, more than 100,000 visitors showed up. The model homes were toured so many times that the carpet had to be replaced after the first weekend. People wanted this. They had been waiting for someone to offer it. The post-war company pension system was the economic engine that made all of this possible for the industrial working class. Under pressure from unions and with the encouragement of favourable tax treatment from the federal government, large American corporations established defined benefit pension plans that promised workers a specific monthly payment in retirement based on their years of service and final salary. A worker who spent 30 years at Ford or General Electric or US Steel could retire at 65 and receive a pension that, combined with Social Security, provided something close to a livable income. Not lavish, but livable and predictable, which after the chaos of the Depression and the war was worth an enormous amount psychologically. What nobody fully appreciated at the time was how specifically the golden age of retirement depended on conditions that were not going to last forever. The demographic ratio, 16 workers for every Social Security recipient in 1950, was the product of the baby boom working its way through the system, combined with the relatively small number of survivors from pre-Social Security generations. The defined benefit pension depended on large, stable corporations operating in industries that faced limited competition. The suburban retirement lifestyle depended on cheap energy, cheap land, and an economy growing fast enough to fund all of its commitments simultaneously. Each of these conditions was finite. The people settling happily into Sun City in 1960 weren't thinking about any of that. They were playing golf in January in Arizona for the first time in their lives, and honestly, good for them. They had earned it. The complications could wait a few decades. While the United States was building its relatively modest retirement architecture, much of Western Europe was constructing something considerably more ambitious. In Britain, the post-war Labour government implemented the Beveridge Report's vision of a comprehensive welfare state, including a universal state pension funded by national insurance contributions. Scandinavia developed among the most generous pension systems in the world, offering high replacement rates, meaning pensions that replaced a large percentage of pre-retirement income, combined with universal health care and extensive elder care services. France built a system of layered retirement protection. Germany expanded and improved upon Bismarck's original architecture, and the Netherlands created pension arrangements so robust that they would be studied and envied by policy wonks for decades. The differences between national systems were significant. Contribution rates, benefit levels, eligibility ages, and the balance between public and private provision varied enormously. But the underlying principle was broadly shared. The state had a responsibility to ensure that people who had worked throughout their lives could live in dignity when they could no longer work. The Beveridge Report of 1942 is one of the more remarkable documents in the history of social policy, partly because of what it proposed and partly because of when it was proposed. Britain was in the middle of the Second World War. Cities were being bombed. The outcome of the conflict was genuinely uncertain, and William Beveridge, a civil servant with the enthusiasm of a man who had been waiting his entire career for someone to ask him to redesign society, produced a 400-page report recommending the comprehensive elimination of what he called the 5 giants: want, disease, ignorance, squalor, and idleness, through a universal system of social insurance covering every British citizen from cradle to grave. The report sold 600,000 copies. People queued for it. There were queues, in wartime Britain, for a government report about social policy. Something had shifted in what people were willing to imagine was possible. The Scandinavian approach to pension provision took the universalist principle further than almost anyone else. Sweden, Denmark, and Norway built systems that were genuinely comprehensive, not just covering workers in formal employment, but extending to farmers, the self-employed, and people who had spent their careers in caring roles that the market didn't pay for. The philosophy behind these systems was explicitly collectivist. Retirement security was not something you earned individually through a specific employment relationship. It was something the society provided to all its members as a matter of right. The premium you paid for this generosity was high taxes, and the Scandinavian countries paid them, generation after generation, with a consistency that reflected a genuine cultural consensus about what kind of society they wanted to be. The contrast with the American model was striking and became more so over time. American retirement security was layered and fragmented. Social security as the baseline, employer pensions for those lucky enough to have them, personal savings for those with the income to save, and nothing much for those who fell through the gaps. European systems were more unified, more universal, and generally more generous. They were also more expensive, and the argument about whether the European model was sustainable or whether the American model was adequate has been running continuously ever since, with both sides regularly finding new evidence that they are right, and the other side is heading for catastrophe. Neither catastrophe has fully materialized yet, which suggests that the answer is probably more complicated than either side's preferred narrative. The history of retirement is also, inevitably, a history of who got to retire and who didn't, and the answer follows the familiar fault lines of race, gender, and class with depressing consistency. The original Social Security Act's exclusion of domestic workers and agricultural labourers was not accidental. It was a deliberate accommodation of Southern legislators who refused to support any program that might reduce the labour discipline of black workers in the Jim Crow South. Private pension systems in the post-war era were built around the model of the male, full-time, long-tenure industrial worker, leaving women who had worked intermittent careers or who had worked primarily in caregiving roles with significantly less protection. Domestic workers, farm labourers, and low-wage service workers who spent their lives in exhausting physical labour were often the least likely to accumulate the pension credits, savings, or access to employer-sponsored retirement plans that made a comfortable retirement possible. The image of retirement as a leisure-filled reward was available to some. For others, the ancient reality, working as long as the body allowed, then depending on family or charity for whatever remained, persisted well into the modern era, and in many forms persists still. The gendered structure of retirement inequality deserves particular attention because it operated through mechanisms that were almost invisible to the people designing the systems. Pension formulas based on years of continuous full-time employment disadvantaged women because women's careers were structurally more likely to be interrupted by marriage, by childbirth, by caring for sick children or aging parents in ways that were not freely chosen but were socially compelled. A woman who spent 5 years out of the workforce caring for her children and another 3 years caring for her parents-in-law lost years of Social Security contribution credits and years of employer pension vesting that she could never get back. The system treated these gaps as evidence of lesser attachment to the workforce. The reality was that she had been doing work, essential, socially necessary work, that the formal economy did not compensate and the pension system did not recognize. The racial dimensions were both more explicit and more brutal. In the American South, the exclusion of agricultural and domestic workers from the original Social Security Act was specifically designed to preserve the existing labour market structure, which depended on black workers having no economic alternative to extremely low-wage employment. If elderly black workers could collect Social Security, they had a degree of economic independence that their employers found threatening. The exclusion removed that threat. It also meant that a generation of black workers who had contributed their labour to the Southern economy, their entire lives reached old age with no federal retirement protection whatsoever, dependent on the same white-dominated local charity systems that had failed them at every other point in their lives. These exclusions were progressively addressed over the following decades. Agricultural and domestic workers were brought into Social Security coverage in the 1950s. Medicare removed the catastrophic medical cost risk in 1965, and various reforms expanded coverage for lower-income workers and surviving spouses. But each expansion came late, came after years of unnecessary suffering, and came only when the political cost of inaction exceeded the political cost of change. The history of who retirement was built for is also the history of who had enough political power to demand inclusion. The people who needed retirement security most urgently were often the people least positioned to demand it. That pattern, policy built around the needs of those with the political voice to shape it, is not ancient history. It is the present tense in multiple countries right now. The retirement age of 65, which became standard in much of the industrialized world, has always had an air of scientific precision about it that is entirely unearned. When Germany set its pension age at 70 in 1889, the choice was explicitly financial. Few people would live to collect. When the age was later reduced to 65 in the 1920s, the rationale was a mix of political compromise and rough calculation about the point at which industrial workers' productive capacity typically declined. When Franklin Roosevelt's architects designed Social Security, they largely adopted 65 as the eligibility age, partly to match existing state pension systems and partly because it seemed like a reasonable number. Over time, 65 acquired the status of a social fact, the age at which retirement was normal, expected, even culturally scripted. But it was always essentially arbitrary. It bore no consistent relationship to actual human life expectancy, which has risen dramatically since the concept was established. It bore no consistent relationship to the age at which different types of workers actually experienced physical decline. It was a number that got adopted, became standard, and now sits at the centre of enormous policy debates about whether it remains sustainable, equitable, or even sensible. Think about what 65 actually means biologically, which is to say, very little. The human body does not cross a threshold at 65. There is no metabolic event, no neurological transition, no hormonal shift that occurs specifically at 65 years of age and renders a person categorically different from how they were at 64. People age at different rates, in different ways, shaped by genetics, by the physical demands of their specific work, by their access to healthcare and nutrition, and by the particular lottery of their personal health history. A 65-year-old former coal miner and a 65-year-old retired professor are not in the same physical situation, and treating them as if they are, as if a single number captures something meaningful about both of their capacities and needs, reflects administrative convenience rather than physiological reality. The number 65 became standard partly through adoption and partly through self-reinforcement. Once Social Security set the eligibility age at 65, employer pension plans tended to use the same number for simplicity. Once employer pension plans used 65, union contracts negotiated around it. Once union contracts embedded it, it became the cultural expectation. People began organising their financial planning around 65 as the target date. The Social Security statement told them how much they'd receive at 65. The financial advisor asked when they planned to retire and assumed 65 was the answer. The number had achieved a kind of institutional momentum that bore no relationship to whatever rough calculation had produced it in the first place. What makes this particularly interesting is what has happened to life expectancy in the meantime. A 65-year-old American man in 1940, the first year Social Security benefits were paid, could expect to live roughly another 12 years to about 77. A 65-year-old American man today can expect to live another 18 or 19 years. For women, the gap is even larger. The retirement that was designed to cover the final fragile years of a worn-out industrial worker is now covering what is, for many people, a substantial independent chapter of life, potentially 2 decades of relatively healthy, active living. The financial systems designed to support that retirement were not built for that duration. The demographic arithmetic that made them affordable assumed a much shorter average payout period. Every serious conversation about the sustainability of pension systems eventually arrives at this gap between what was designed and what actually happened. And the political conversation about what to do about it, raise the eligibility age, increase contributions, reduce benefits, some combination of all three, is one of the defining arguments of the next several decades. For most of the 20th century, the financial logic of public pension systems rested on a demographic reality. There were many workers paying in and relatively few retirees collecting. In the United States in the 1950 ratios, there were roughly 16 workers for every Social Security beneficiary. The math was comfortable. Then something happened. The baby boom generation, born between roughly 1946 and 1964, moved through the demographic pipeline with the inexorable force of a python digesting a large meal. Combined with declining birth rates in subsequent generations, this created the demographic crunch that policy wonks had been anxiously modelling for decades. As the boomers retired in enormous numbers beginning in the 2010s, the worker-to-beneficiary ratio fell dramatically. Meanwhile, people were living longer, much longer than the designers of these systems had anticipated. The gap between when people retired and when they died, once measured in a few years, stretched into decades. A system designed to support people in their final fragile years was now supporting people through 20, 30, or even more years of post-working life. The math, put simply, had stopped working as originally intended. The defined benefit pension, the kind that promised a specific monthly payment for life, funded by the employer, was the first to crack under this pressure in the private sector. Corporations looking at their pension obligations in the 1980s and 90s saw a liability that was growing faster than their ability to fund it, and they began, quietly at first and then with increasing speed, to shift away from defined benefit plans toward defined contribution plans, the 401k model, in which the employer contributes a fixed amount and the employee bears the investment risk. The shift was enormously consequential for retirement security. Under a defined benefit plan, the employer absorbed the risk that the market would underperform or that the retiree would live longer than expected. Under a defined contribution plan, all of that risk transferred to the individual. A worker who retired in 2008, just as the financial crisis was demolishing the stock market, discovered the full meaning of that risk transfer in terms that were not abstract at all. The public pension crisis the problem of state and local government pension systems that had made promises they couldn't keep, played out over a longer timeline and with more political complexity. Public sector workers, from teachers to firefighters to municipal employees, had often accepted lower wages than their private sector counterparts in exchange for defined benefit pension promises, when those promises turned out to be inadequately funded, when decades of optimistic actuarial assumptions and politically convenient underfunding caught up with the numbers, the resulting crisis fell on everyone simultaneously. Current workers found their benefit formulas changed. Retirees found their cost of living adjustments reduced. Taxpayers found pension costs consuming larger and larger shares of public budgets that were trying to do everything else at the same time. Cities like Detroit and Stockton entered bankruptcy partly under the weight of pension obligations that had accumulated over decades of decisions that each seemed manageable individually and became collectively catastrophic. The crisis was not a surprise to anyone who'd been paying attention to the demographics since the 1960s. The actuaries knew, the economists knew, various government reports and academic papers had been describing the coming crunch for decades. What was missing was not information but political will, the will to ask current workers and current retirees to accept less, or current taxpayers to pay more, in service of a mathematical problem whose full consequences were still years away. Politicians who proposed solutions to long-term pension sustainability tended to be punished by the constituencies whose benefits they were trying to restructure. Politicians who deferred the problem tended to be rewarded. The result was a predicted, and entirely avoidable slow-motion collision between the commitments that had been made and the resources available to keep them. For most of human history, people worked because they had no choice. But as retirement became a normal expectation, researchers began to notice something uncomfortable. Actually stopping work, fully and completely, was not uniformly good for people. Studies began accumulating, suggesting that retirement, particularly abrupt, complete retirement without adequate social connection, purpose, or engagement, was associated with cognitive decline, increased rates of depression, and in some cases significantly increased mortality. The human brain, it turned out, did not respond well to the sudden removal of structure, problem-solving demands, and social engagement that work, even unpleasant work, had been providing. This created an awkward situation for retirement advocates and a goldmine for researchers. The concept of active retirement, of phased retirement, of second careers and volunteering and purposeful engagement in later life emerged partly in response to this evidence. And it raised a question that Bismarck certainly never considered. If working is, in some ways, good for you, and if retirement is not simply rest but a complex social and psychological transition, what exactly are we building these systems to provide? The research on retirement and health is genuinely complicated. Complicated enough that anyone who claims to have a simple answer is probably oversimplifying. The health effects of retirement depend enormously on what kind of work you were doing before you stopped. For people in physically demanding jobs, construction workers, miners, factory workers, retirement is associated with meaningful health improvements. Stopping the physical grind, getting more sleep, eating regularly, having time to exercise and manage chronic health conditions, all of this translates into measurable improvements in physical health outcomes. The body that had been absorbing punishment for decades gets a chance to recover, and it often does. But for people in cognitively demanding jobs, professionals, managers, knowledge workers, the picture is more ambiguous. The loss of daily cognitive challenge, the loss of structured problem solving, the loss of the social environment that work provided, these can, in the absence of adequate replacement, produce effects that look disturbingly like accelerated aging. Several longitudinal studies have found that cognitive decline accelerates following retirement, particularly in the first few years, and particularly for people who retire abruptly rather than gradually. The brain, like the body, responds to the demands placed on it. Remove the demands, and some of the capacity follows. The social dimension of retirement is perhaps the most underappreciated aspect of the transition. For many people, particularly men who in previous generations often built their social networks primarily through work. The office or the factory floor was not just where they worked. It was where they spent most of their waking hours, where their close friendships were maintained, where they had an identity and a role, and a daily reason to show up and interact with other human beings. Remove that, and the social isolation that follows can be genuinely dangerous. Loneliness, as the research increasingly shows, is not just an unpleasant feeling, it is a measurable health risk, associated with increased rates of heart disease, cognitive decline, immune suppression, and premature death. The retiree who loses their work community and doesn't actively build a replacement is not just bored. They may be in genuine health jeopardy, which raises a somewhat uncomfortable question about the paradise that all those Sun City brochures were selling. Leisure is wonderful, but meaning matters, and for many people, work, for all its frustrations, was where the meaning lived. Replacing it turns out to require more intentional effort than anyone thought to mention. Not every society developed a formal retirement system, and in parts of the world where state pension coverage remains limited, the ancient pattern persists with only minor modifications. In many low and middle-income countries, the majority of the elderly population has no access to formal pension income. They work as long as they physically can, then rely on their children and extended family networks. This is not always miserable. Strong family ties and multi-generational households can provide genuine support and dignity. But it is precarious, particularly in societies experiencing rapid urbanization, declining birth rates, and the loosening of traditional family obligations. The tension between the modernizing family structure, in which adult children move to cities, establish independent households, and have fewer children themselves, and the traditional expectation that those children will support their aging parents, is playing out across the developing world right now, in real time, with no clean resolution in sight. What is being discovered, repeatedly and painfully, is that the invention of retirement was not just a policy convenience. It solved a real social problem that families and communities alone could not reliably handle. China provides perhaps the most dramatic current illustration of this tension, because China is experiencing demographic change on a scale and at a speed that has no historical precedent. The one-child policy, implemented from 1979 to 2015, produced a generation of only children who now face the prospect of supporting 2 aging parents and potentially 4 aging grandparents with the income of a single household. The traditional Chinese expectation of filial piety, the Confucian obligation that had served as the backbone of elder care for 2,000 years, was designed for a world of large families, where the burden of caring for aging parents was distributed across multiple children. It was not designed for a 4-to-1 family structure, and the strain is visible in ways that Chinese society is still working out how to acknowledge. In sub-Saharan Africa, where formal pension coverage often reaches less than 10% of the elderly population, the family remains the primary support system in ways that are both admirable and exhausting. Extended family networks that absorb elderly members provide a form of social insurance that Western welfare states struggle to replicate. The multi-generational household, where grandparents contribute childcare and accumulated wisdom, while younger family members provide economic support and physical care, functions as a mutual aid system that serves everyone's needs simultaneously. But it functions on the assumption that the younger generation has enough income, enough space, enough stability to absorb the additional people. When economic shocks, drought, or disease disrupt that assumption, the elderly members of the household are often the ones who absorb the impact first. What the international evidence consistently shows is that the transition from family-based elder support to state-based retirement systems is not simply a matter of economic development. It is a social reorganization that changes the relationships between generations in ways that cannot be reversed. Once adult children are no longer the primary source of old age security for their parents, the nature of the relationship changes. The ancient implicit contract, I raise you, you support me, is renegotiated or simply dissolved. What replaces it, if the state system is adequate, is something that might actually be healthier, a relationship between parents and adult children that is not structured around economic obligation, that can be more freely chosen and more genuinely affectionate. If the state system is inadequate, what replaces it is simply insecurity, wearing the face of modernity. The 20th century didn't just create retirement, it created a new life stage that had never existed before at scale. In previous eras, the period between the end of working life and death was typically short, often painful, and defined primarily by decline and dependency. The combination of better healthcare, better nutrition, and better economic support in wealthy countries created something genuinely novel. A large population of people who were past their primary working years, but who were healthy, active, educated, and potentially engaged for another decade or 2 or 3. The sociology of aging was essentially rewritten. Concepts like the third age, the active, engaged period between retirement and serious physical decline, entered the vocabulary. The idea that old age could be a time of growth, creativity, new learning, and continued contribution rather than simply waiting for the end was not available to previous generations in the same way. Whether society has fully caught up with this reality in terms of how it treats elderly people, how it values their time and contributions, and how it funds their care, is a question that answers itself every time you spend an afternoon trying to help a grandparent navigate a smartphone. The sociologist Peter Laslett, who coined the term third age in the 1980s, was describing something that genuinely required a new vocabulary because it was genuinely new. The first age is childhood and education, preparation for life. The second age is working life and family formation, the active, productive, socially obligated decades. The third age is what comes after, the period when the primary obligations have been discharged, the children are grown, the career is complete, and what remains is time, potentially a great deal of time, to be filled with whatever the individual actually wants to do with it. The fourth age, in Laslett's framework, is the final period of dependency and decline. The third age is the space between the second and the fourth, and for many people in wealthy countries today, it is longer than either of the ages that bracket it. What this means in practice is that the cultural script for old age needed to be rewritten, and in many ways it still is being rewritten in real time. The previous script, work, then brief decline, then death, had the advantage of simplicity. Everyone understood their role. The new script, in which a 65-year-old has potentially 20 years of healthy active life ahead of them, is much less clear. Are you supposed to travel? Learn new skills? Start a business? Volunteer? Write the book you always meant to write? Take up competitive cycling? Move somewhere warm? All of the above? The freedom is genuine and the options are real, but freedom without structure is its own kind of challenge. And many people discover in the transition to retirement that having unlimited time is considerably more complicated than they had imagined during the years when they had very little of it. The industries that have grown up around this new life stage are a reliable indicator of its scale and its complexity. Senior living communities, continuing education programs for older adults, adventure travel companies catering to active retirees, fitness programs designed for aging bodies, encore career programs for people who want to work but differently. All of these represent a commercial response to the reality that tens of millions of people are in the third age and are trying to figure out what to do with it. Gerontology, the scientific study of aging, has grown from a minor subspecialty into a major field precisely because the questions it addresses have become urgently relevant to a very large number of people. The ancient world produced almost no systematic thinking about what old age was for. The modern world is producing a great deal of it, because for the first time in history, enough people are living long enough for the question to matter at scale. The invention of retirement is one of the least celebrated social innovations in human history. which is strange when you consider what it actually represents. For most of the 100,000 years or so that Homo sapiens has walked the earth, old age was defined by necessity. You worked until you couldn't. Then you depended on whoever would have you, and then you died, often not long after. The idea that a society might collectively agree to support its older members in something resembling dignity and ease, funded by the contributions of working people across generations, is genuinely extraordinary. It required surplus production, political will, administrative capacity, and a moral framework that valued elderly lives beyond their immediate economic utility. All of those things had to come together, and they didn't come together everywhere, and they haven't come together for everyone, and they remain contested and fragile even where they exist. But on the nights when you are lying in a clean bed, comfortably arranged, warm, not particularly worried about wolves or famine or the harvest, it is worth a moment to consider the very long road that led here, and the enormous number of people who walk that road without ever getting to rest at the end of it. What makes retirement such a strange gift is that almost nobody who received it recognised it as such at the time it was being built. The workers who lobbied for pension rights in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were fighting for basic dignity, fighting to not die in the poorhouse, fighting against a system that used them up and discarded them. They were not imagining Sun City. They were not imagining 30-year retirements and cruise ship itineraries and the particular luxury problem of having too much time. They were imagining not starving. They were imagining not having to work in a factory at 68 because there was no other option. The gap between what they were fighting for and what their grandchildren eventually received is a measure of how much progress was actually made, and also a reminder of how much of that progress was contingent, hard-won, and never fully secure. The fragility of the retirement concept is something the 21st century has been making impossible to ignore. The defined benefit pension, which once seemed like the bedrock of the working-class retirement security, has largely disappeared from the private sector. The defined contribution system that replaced it has shifted enormous investment risk onto individuals who are never trained to manage it and who lack the institutional tools to do so effectively. Social Security faces long-term funding gaps that nobody in American politics has found the courage to address honestly. The demographic bulge of the baby boomers is passing through the system right now, straining it in precisely the ways that were predicted and not addressed. And underneath all of this is the deeper question, the question that Bismarck's original calculation avoided and that every subsequent retirement system has only partially answered, of what we actually owe each other across the arc of a human life. Because that is ultimately what retirement is about. It is not primarily about economics, though it is deeply implicated in economics. It is not primarily about demographics, though demographics shape everything about how it functions. It is about a moral claim, the claim that a person who has contributed to a society's functioning over a lifetime is owed something by that society when they can no longer contribute in the same way. That claim has been contested throughout human history. It was dismissed for most of it. It was partially acknowledged in monastery almshouses and guild welfare funds and Roman veteran settlements. It was formally institutionalized for the first time by a conservative German politician who was trying to defeat his political enemies, and it has been expanded imperfectly and incompletely in the century and a half since. Tonight, as you drift off in whatever comfortable arrangement you've achieved, pillow positioned correctly, temperature approximately right, the immediate future not requiring anything from you, you are, among other things, the beneficiary of that long argument. Most of the people who made it possible never got to be. That's the gift. It arrived late, it arrived unevenly, and it still hasn't arrived for everyone. But here, tonight, for you, it arrived. And so, here we are. At the end of a very long road that began, as so many things do, with someone trying not to freeze to death, or not to starve, or not to be a burden to people who were already struggling under their own weight. The road passed through Roman veterans collecting their settlements, through medieval guild brothers splitting their dues with old men who could no longer work a trade, through Bismarck sitting in Berlin calculating how cheaply he could undercut the socialists, through Ida Mae Fuller cashing her first $22 Social Security check in Vermont, through 100,000 ordinary people fighting for the modest, stubborn idea that a life of work should not end in a poorhouse. For most of human history, nobody got to stop. You worked because the alternative was dependency, and dependency was either the kindness of your children, which could not be guaranteed, or the cold mercy of an institution that wanted you to feel bad about needing it. The ancient default was simple: be useful or be a problem. And when you were finally too old, too broken, too worn through to be useful anymore, you hoped. You hoped your family had enough. You hoped the harvest had been good. You hoped the people around you were kind. They often were. That is one of the things that gets lost when we talk about history as a catalogue of systems and policies and legislation. The systems were inadequate, the policies were cruel, the legislation arrived late and excluded too many people. But inside all of that failure, human beings were taking care of each other. Medieval grandmothers were being tucked into the warm corner near the fire. Roman veterans were being welcomed back into their home villages. Children, more often than the clay tablets of complaint would suggest, were feeding their aging parents and meaning it. People have always found ways to look after each other that no institution fully captures and no policy fully replaces. What the long invention of retirement added to all of that human decency was something that decency alone couldn't provide: reliability. The promise that your security in old age would not depend entirely on whether your children happened to be alive, solvent, nearby, and in a good mood. That the floor beneath you would hold regardless. That you had earned something that could not be taken away by a bad harvest or a family quarrel, or the simple fact of having outlived everyone who might have cared for you. That promise is still imperfect. It still leaves people out. It is still being argued over and underfunded and reformed and threatened and defended in legislatures and actuarial tables and conversations at kitchen tables between people who are quietly worried about whether the math will hold. The argument is not over. It was never going to be over. These are the oldest arguments human beings have. What do we owe each other? How much of each other's burdens do we carry? When someone has given everything they have to give, what do we give back? But tonight, for the duration of this particular night, those arguments can rest. Tonight you are warm and fed and horizontal, and the darkness outside is not the darkness that medieval peasants feared, the darkness that brought the cold and the wolves and the endless reminder that survival was never guaranteed. Tonight, you're the end of a very long story, and the ending for once is quiet. Sleep well.